yeah, that's me and my talk. So my talk is about the still life I did in about August, mid-August, and a breakdown of what I did to the still life to make it look like it is. You will see the still life later. So the workshop is divided into 3 parts. The first part is the introduction, where we are right now. Then we have the making of, that's the main part. And then, if there's time, we have a live demo where I go with one object through the whole iteration. The modeling, I won't do modeling because modeling is always a time-consuming task. I will do unwrapping, Substance Painter workflow, and then I'll go into Octane and then show you the result. That won't be very pretty because in Substance Painter you need more time to make stuff pretty than just 5 minutes or so. But we'll see even if we even go that far and take it there. Hopefully we'll have time. All right, so for those who don't know me, I'm a generalist in 3D. I do 3D and compositing. I have a small office that I share with a colleague, Thomas Fieler, in Ludwigsburg, and I do almost all work from there, but I also sometimes work on location with studios and do some other stuff. And I'm also doing trainings, so PBR-based training and workflow improvements. Yeah, what else? Well, my specialty is the physical-based rendering and lighting of things, so make them as close to reality, most realistic as I can, which ironically isn't what I did with the still life. It's still rather realistic, but I try to make it more painterly, if that's a thing. So what I do all day is like doing small projects, animations. I didn't bring client work here because I don't normally use client work as like presentation stuff. So I brought you 2 short films or 2 animations I did recently. So if that will switch to first technical difficulties. I think the driver tries to go over the GPU, and we have to reset the sound to that one. Yeah, okay. So now from something rather old, thank you, to something a bit more modern. It's shorter. It's just a, well, small piece, I guess. And that's it. So, all right. You can watch the first one again. Sorry, wrong one. Oh, okay, here we go. So, don't confuse things. Right. So, back to the presentation. Having difficulties here. Okay. So, work life is a still life inspired by the old masters. So, if you go into a museum and watch the old oil paintings of still lifes, I very much got inspired by that and did a first one a couple of years ago, and this summer I did a second one, and that's it. Well, that's just a part of it. It's just a part of the reveal. I revealed it at industry workshops in London, so that's why I rendered this reveal, and that's the final picture here. So that's the still life I'm talking about today. Finally, you get to see it. So why do I choose a still life? It's because it's sort of a benchmark for artists to, in the past, practice their paint strokes and trying to get the light and atmosphere to work the best to get the whole composition with the mood it was in when they painted it. And I just thought it would be nice, obviously I'm not the first guy that thought that, would be nice to do something similar in 3D. Because in 3D, you just have different tools, but you can achieve the same with, you exchange brush strokes for shaders, and you exchange lighting for, lighting for lighting, I guess, for digital lighting, and atmosphere for volume and fog. And then you have sort of similar tool set than a painter had back in the day. The still life is obviously try to make it rather detailed. So I've gone in there and added dust and spider webs and sort of details that make it more realistic, because I noticed that the more detail a picture has, the more realistic, or the more you feel that it's not computer generated. So I've gone in and added some dust layers and some other things to it that makes it give it more depth or more the sense of being aged. With the still life, as I said, you have the paint strokes, and while a painter is mixing color, we are doing that with shaders. So there are different sets of shaders implemented in here that represent different kind of objects. So first of all, there's this vase, the handle of the knife, and the plate, where we have very rather basic colors. They're just diffuse shaders with a reflection on top. So that looks like that. Hopefully you can see it's a little bit from, even though they did a great job here, it's quite dim. And then we have the same thing, but a little bit more complicated. So the pumpkin and the rope is done with some displacements. So you barely can see the rope because it's in the dark corner back in the background. But the pumpkin, you can see that it gets its final look with the displacement on top. Then we have all the metal parts in the scene. And if you look here, you can see that there's some difference in there. So we have rusty metal on the cog reels. We have the funnel here that is like with an oily substance, and therefore hair stick to it or dust sticks to it. Then we have like very clean knife metal because it gets washed every day. I don't remember the term. And then the aluminium from the milk can also looks way more rough than other metal pieces here. Obviously, we have the feathers back there. That's made with the Maxon with the Maxon hair set to feather mode. It misses some features, if you ask me, but I got it where I have it in the render, so I could take it even further, but there were no controls there, so I left it there. So you have the coloring and the fine translucency in there. Sorry, you can't really see that right now. Then obviously we have glass. Glass is rather simple, and I always say that glass is the sum of its environment. So if you have a glass object and your environment is shit, then your glass object likely to look shit also, because it either refracts or reflects light, and if there's nothing to reflect or refract, then the glass obviously has nothing to go after. So with the glass, it's obviously I did more to the glass than just make it transparent. I added small fingerprints on the cheese cover and on the vase with the wine in there. It's like if you have a container of fluid for a longer time, there's some patina forming inside, because there's always a bit of what's it called, Verdunstung going on. So it will form like some rings and stuff, and that's what I tried here. Sorry, it's not very bright. And then last but not least, the king of materials are subsurface scattered materials. So obviously the tomatoes, the cheese, a lot of scattering is always related to food, and since still life is obviously a lot of food, there's a lot of scattering going on. But also, of course, the candle in the background, wax, is a very often used material to show off subsurface scattering, and then the bones of the cat skull here, but also the cloth piece in the front, because if you look at cloth and the light penetrating, it definitely has subsurface scattering. All right, some technical data here. So render time was rather long. This is because it was rendered with volumes, and I had, if you look to the bottom of the piece, you see that there's quite a lot of gray depth here. So I did that to get the scattering right and the volume with the 16 diffuse depth, and with the glossy depth of 32. It's always necessary, if you have glass and want to make it realistic, you have to go to extremely high ray depths to get the fine detail out of glass pieces. So it's no difference here. So I just had the render power and I left it rendering overnight. So I just, why not take it to the best way, to the best level I can. And obviously that's rendered with 8 cards, so quite a bit of rendering power there, but in 6K resolution, so that's also why it took so long. When I started working on that, I thought, well, it might take 1 to 2 weeks to go over that and process everything, but in the end, it took 4 weeks, and that's almost non-stop work. That's because I really was struggling with a lot of the composition and the colors on the objects all fitting together in a nice way. And you know that moment, sometimes it really clicks and you do something and all works out just fine. There's the exact opposite sometimes. So you work on something and nothing works. But I had to do the presentation in London, so I couldn't go, whatever. So I had to do it and had force my way through it. So yeah, I struggled with all of the aspects of that. So finally we arrived at the making of. Where's the time? Already 20 minutes, okay. So I obviously had inspiration from contemporary artists that I couldn't include in my presentation, but I thought might be clever and just show the websites of those artists. Not sure if that's legally better, but at least I try that. So some of the, or more or less all of the objects might be very familiar to you from what I just showed you. So I had this inspiration here for the goblet, and that's by that artist, if you can pronounce that, I don't know. Then we have the Jason Graff. He is, I think, I'm not sure where he's from, but he does some really great paintings. They look like photographs, or like even more hyper-realistic than photographs. And especially that one I was drawn towards with the goblet that was fallen, and so I put some of the same goblet in my scene. Then we have, sorry, where's the name? Lertzi. There's no surname to that, but I oriented myself with that towards that vase I put on the right side of the still life. And she also has this milk can very much ripped off, just perspective and all. I just liked the way it looked, so I thought, why not take that and put it in my picture? Of course, I had to remodel it, but you can see why I took it. It looks really nice. And those are not paintings; those are photographs, I think, at least. And finally, Olish, I think it's called. So he has this very old industrial still life where he puts old oil cans and stuff like that in. So I took the funnel from there and was inspired here to put that in my still life. So hopefully I don't get any legal legal problems here. So back to the presentation. So I started with a concept. So the concept in the beginning looked like this. So I trying to draw stuff when I have the idea. And you can see it's quite good match between the final thing and what I drawn in the first. And no, it's not that I want to impress you and I've drawn that afterwards, like in school where you have to give some drawings with the project to get a higher grade. So I really did that beforehand. You can see that the proportions are different, but there's this feather here in some kind of waist, and there's here the I don't know what you call it, like the carafe or something. Then that switched to the milk can, and then here's a way bigger cogwheel. Then the hammer is obviously turned upside down, and instead of a funnel, I had an oil can. But in overall, with the centerpiece being the goblet here, it really matches what I did in the end. Right, so we go through the different stages that I took to do that picture. And I have prepared a plus and minus for every technique I've used. So with subdivision surface technique, obviously the pluses, you get a very clean mesh, if you do it right, of course. And that gets you to the next point. If you need UVs from such objects, you can get easy UVs from there because you have a clean mesh. If you once tried to unwrap cat data, it's a nightmare. So I've needed to do that in the past, and I really prefer subdivision surface meshes. Of course, you get the nice beveled corners for realism, because every object needs beveled corners. It's really a thing that makes a night and day difference. So the minus, of course, is I called it modeling syntax. So I needed a long time to adjust to different edge flows and what to do when I encounter a certain edge situation. So it's like learning a language. If you used to like answering someone and the model dictates what like the mesh flow should be, and you then answer with your technique by doing that and trying to compensate for any bad decisions. Yeah, and of course that is time consuming. So learning modeling itself is time consuming, and then modeling itself is time consuming. So, but you have the benefit of the UVs. So let's go through almost all of the objects. So those are rather simple one, like round objects are always the easiest. You can just either use a, what's it called, lathe knobs, or you can just model them and then just adjust the width of the polygon rings, what I normally do, because it gives me greater flexibility. When I model stuff like that, I always try to model it with a thick wall, so you can make it glass, because I wasn't quite sure if it would end up in glass or in porcelain or something else, so I modeled it so it would be not doing anything strange when I decided to make it a glass object. Also, the cup and the lower part are not touching, because that would cause problems with the ray tracing when I decided to turn it to glass. So not symmetrical objects, but semi-symmetrical objects are really easy to do, like this pumpkin, the tomato. And tomatoes like that's really exist. It looks like a lazy excuse for a tomato. But I was walking through the supermarket and was paying extra attention to the fruit section, or the, I don't know what's called fruit section, let's call it fruit section. So I've seen that tomatoes and thought, that might be interesting to put in a render, so I did. Then we have slightly more complex objects where we have rounded corners, but they end up in a square design down. Also, it's thin, double walled, so we can get a glass object out of that. Then I modeled that nut. I think it's called nut. I didn't do the inner screw part, but I did it with that one. So I really modeled that thing to look more realistic, because I wanted it to be more in the foreground, and I knew that it's always better to have a model than just using not subdivision, to use displacement. Then a frame where you carefully place like the edges, the metal things in the edges, to not end up in the render at all, because it's in an angle you don't see them. The hammer with like bit more complicated geometry, especially the metal thing on the top to hold the hammer to the handle. Then the book, it's almost unnoticeable in the picture because the milk can stands on it and the cat skull takes up the front part of it. But it's nice to have like things buried inside, so you barely don't notice it, and then just if you look long enough, you can see, oh, there's a book in there. Then we have objects that are not occurring in the image. That's because I wasn't sure what was fitting, and I was constantly arranging and rearranging them, and it was like, yeah, then suddenly this object doesn't fit, and I needed to model that one because it fits much better. Then I was tired of just simple round objects, so I made some variation with like a cut glass or something like that. It ended up to being a copper cup. Of course, the cheese with the cover. The funnel isn't too difficult either. The only difficult thing was the handle there, where I needed to have some kind of railing. Then thanks for Cornelius Demerick for the simulation. So I talked to him to do the simulation for me because he has a what's it called, Marvelous Designer license. And so he only had time in the night, so we were sitting there at midnight and over Skype, and can you push the clothes a little bit back, and can you do a fold there? And I felt like this meme where the client sits in back of the artist and go, I felt very bad at this moment, but we managed to get a good result out of it, so thanks, Cornelius. Then the candle that you also almost don't see in the render was a challenge to get the dripping wax modeled, but it's not a big deal. It's like just a few drops. So then the knife, obviously, then the milk can. So the objects themselves aren't too difficult. You can see that I try to be rather clean with the mesh, and that's what's taking the time in that. Then diadem that I also didn't use. I guess I was a bit influenced by Wonder Woman at the time. But it didn't look good in the picture, so I didn't bring it in. So there, the cogwheels that are in the scene. I actually used the cogwheel, the infamous cogwheel tool in Cinema 4D to get the base laid out, and then I just deleted points and reshaped it to be subdivision surface usable. The rope, it's just a sweep with twisted shape of like together a couple of circles that are stitched together. So it's not really, it looks more like more work than it actually was. The most work here was to get the alignment so it looked like a bound rope. Then the hero object, the goblet, there the most difficult thing was to model in those spikes. I don't know what you call that, so cut edges or something. Yeah, took me a bit, but actually in the end I managed to. There's a couple of 3 polygon like triangles in there if you look closely, but and the feather is really simple. I just put hair on the spline and then just adjusted it a little bit. So we are at the learning corner. I don't know if that's a right term in English, but if you know me, I really try to get the knowledge across. So not only showing you stuff, but I'm trying to get you involved into the techniques I've used. So modeling, of course, what I always do and what helps me is to put on symmetrical supporting edges. So supporting edges for the modelers or for the non-modelers are the edges that are across the main edge. And if you don't do that symmetrical, you can run into problems, and you have an easier time if you do that symmetrical and get 2 supporting edges to every edge you want to define. So that's the subdivision surface view. So yeah, that's what I just said. So it's getting you a better mesh workflow. So, but not only that, you can use it for other techniques like getting vertex maps. And if you don't use the symmetrical supporting edge here, the vertex map wouldn't stay up here. It would go down to the next edge. And therefore, it would look, or it doesn't give you granular control as with this technique here. So, although with the subdivision surface, it gets pulled down a little bit though. So for what is subdivision surface, so obviously it helps with the realism of the scene by rounding the corners. So doing that, and suddenly the object gets more dimensional and gets more depth. And why vertex maps? Well, a lot of renderers support vertex maps in the shader. So if you have something like that, where the concave parts of the mesh are vertex mapped, and the convex parts, I always don't know what's convex and what's the other thing, so might be wrong here. But you can get something like that, where there's verdigris inside of the holes here, and then there's like brighter parts where you usually touch the object, and that helps you to get procedural shaders going. So for UVs, I used Rizom UV. It's called UV 3D or something, Unwrap 3D before. I switched from Cinema 4D because Cinema 4D unfortunately didn't develop their UVing tools in the last couple of years. So I did look for another software to support that, and I'm very happy with UV, Rizom UV. So the plus side for UVs is it's generally good to have them. Even if you don't need them, it's a good fallback. If you have problems with materials, you can always bake to UVs then, and then just have a stable map put on your objects. Obviously, it's time consuming to do that for every object, and also you have to learn it, of course. But the learn curve, like the knowledge here, always is like, oh, UVs, don't give me UVs. But it's actually not that bad. If you do it a couple of times, it just is like, I don't know, doing some fixes in Photoshop or something. It's just another task to do. It's not just like something that is very technical and takes time to do. So here are a few screenshots I did for the UV. So that's the screw, that's the hammer, that's the cogwheel. We're trying to get the same result later. So for Windows, there's a plugin for Cinema 4D, then where you can just select the object, click export to UV, and then it opens up in Rizom, and then you can do your unwrap and then save it, and it comes back to Cinema 4D, so it's rather convenient. Right, so Up Substance Painter. I used for half of the objects, maybe a little bit more, I used Substance Painter. For the other half, I used procedural techniques. So with Substance Painter, obviously if you worked with it before, it's like really nice to have like this real-time feedback of the material. So if you tweak your materials, you get real-time feedback. You have a procedural approach, so you bake some base maps down, and this tells the shaders where the object is edgy and where is ambient occlusion happening and so on, and then you can just apply smart materials on it, and it will find like very organic ways to make them look like the object was like rusted or a little bit older. That's what I needed for my still life, so I obviously did use that. So, sorry, the last point was that it has an established PBR workflow, and a lot of renderers out there already support PBR workflows. That means you get 4 maps with different data sets and then get the exact result like you have in Substance Painter in your renderer. Octane right now doesn't do exactly that, but it's very easy to get it to look the same, and I go over that later. So the minus thing is the 4 textures you get for every object. If you're working on a memory constrained project, you use up a lot of memory by giving 4 textures to every object. And if you want to change something in the look of the object, you have to go back to Substance and re-export, or change that and re-export the textures again. And obviously it's dependent on the resolution of the texture. So that's what I get out when I do that in Substance Painter. So this is all procedural. It's called Painter because you can paint on it, but I am very bad at painting, so I try to go the procedural way. And you can just tweak your shaders in a way that it comes up with this, and it fills in the rust in the corners and gets you the used style. So almost the same like I was doing with the vertex maps, but without needing vertex maps beforehand. So that's the hammer. It looks better there than in the render. I don't know why. So the cogwheel with the rusts on it. And I don't obviously show every object because we are here in 3 hours if I do. So the other way I did things was to procedurally generate them with nodes in Octane. So the plus side for that is it's very flexible because you can every time go in Octane and change something and see it in real time in your render. Then obviously it's you can get really complex with that because you can put node after node after node and get really what you want. The If you use noises, it's like not resolution dependent, so you can go very close without seeing pixels. But the downside is, obviously, because of the complex shaders, it needs more render time. It doesn't slow down drastically, but it's obviously for every sample he needs to go through the whole shader tree, so it needs more time. Then obviously it can get complex in the node tree, so you can get lost in there, and then 2 days later you don't know what you did there, and yeah, you have to go through single nodes and see what you did, and happened to me too. And this also is the potential for errors. So if you get a complex node tree and you don't know where it originates, if something doesn't work, you have to search for it, which is time consuming. So here are some of the objects that was done procedurally with shaders and dirt-based to get the wood show up a little bit more aged. That's a mixed approach between a UV. So the scratches were brought in with displacement in the UV, and the rest was more or less procedural. So the desaturation of the color at the edges was a procedural thing done with dirt also. Then here it's almost the same I showed with the vertex maps and the shader. The knife, a little bit more clean because you eat with it. Then the candle with subsurface scattering. I put fingerprints on it because you sometimes reseat the candle to make sure it sits correctly and doesn't burn down the house if it falls. The cheese, I used a mixture of displacement on top and on to form the crust, and then I had the subsurface scattering in the middle part and some like salt stains on the side. Then the berries are falling out of the cup in the still life. What I did here was I didn't want to use the same texture on the berries, on every berry, because it will be very obvious if the texture on every berry will be just the same scratches or the same bumps and stuff like that. So I wrote a little OSL script that uses the random color node. The random color node just gives out a random color for every clone. And that pipes into a projection node there where the OSL script is in. And by the color, I just multiplied the color with the offset of the UV. So you get a different UV offset for every berry, and therefore it's not as similar looking anymore. For the pumpkin, I just used substance and used the displacement output for that to generate that. It's quite funny because the stem there does look shit without displacement. The displacement made it look quite realistic after that. That's the rope. So if you remember, it was like very in a dark corner and out of focus area. So a lot of potential wasted here because I added some hair and some displacement to it to make it really stand out. But when I placed it in the scene in the foreground, it didn't look good. So I placed it way back in the background. That's the cat skull. Also, that's actually a print model. So I looked for a cat skull model somewhere, and I didn't find one till a friend of mine suggested to go into the print community and see if there's a 3D print model of that. And I actually found one. So I just used that brought it into the scene and rendered it. All right, so we are back at the learning corner, and there's no presentation from me without Fresnel. You all know that. So for those who don't know Fresnel, it's like a formula that makes the, have to rethink that in English now. So if you have rays coming toward a surface, dependent on the angle of the ray, it will be the probability if the ray is going to be reflected or refracted. So that's actually what Fresnel is doing. With metal surfaces, that's the dielectric materials, rays can't be refracted, can go inside of the material, so they have to be either absorbed or reflected. So for metals, reflections normally higher. Here's a basic example, and you probably already know that because I show it in every slideshow. This is a black black plastic surface where I put a printed checkerboard on top to reflect on. And this is a 45-degree angle, and you can see that the reflection is rather dim. And if you look at it at a very steep angle, where you can see the reflection of the black surface is almost indistinguishable from the original printed checkerboard. And that's exactly what the Fresnel's doing. Just giving you strength values for the reflection based on the angle you look at objects. You can see that on normal objects too, not only just checkerboard objects. You can see with the PlayStation, it gets way shinier back here because you can see way steeper on the edges. And with the extinguisher here, it's the same on the rim. The other thing that's happening, or not the other thing, but the thing that's happening is mostly only the last couple of degrees before you look directly parallel to the surface. There's one more thing with metals. Metals can have colored reflections, so they tint the reflection, while dielectric materials never do that. The material itself might be blue, but the reflection is not tinted blue with a blue object. So you can see that here. Basically, you can explain everything here. So with a non-tinted metal, you can still see the blue in the sky, but with the golden bell up here, you can see that there's the sky tinted golden. Okay, so that's a video with the IOR changing in materials. The IOR is basically the slowdown of the light when the light travels inside of the material, and therefore therefore controls how much reflectance and how much refraction you get. So the denser the material is, the more refraction you get, and the less reflection you get. You can like if you have a lake and do skipping stones on it, if you have, like, that doesn't exist, but if you have very soft water, the stone is actually going to get, it's easier to not skip but go inside the water. And if you have ice, very hard water, then the stone is going to skip very likely. And that's basically the same for the light rays. If they hit an object and the object is very dense, they are not likely to enter it, or not as likely as to enter it as with like not as dense materials. Right, normally the presentation flips out after I do a video, so we have to go out here. It's like very strange. So let's go back one. Well, basically what follows now is just a breakdown of the objects that I placed in the scene. I did a render 1 or 2 times a day, and I just made a video out of it so you can see the different objects, how they are placed, and my struggle with them. So yeah, let's go full screen here. And there's no music, unfortunately, but you can talk over it a little bit. So I started when I still have no textures on there, so you can see the textures coming on there and everything. There's objects in there that never appear later, so I tried to get stuff going. So you have now the 3 different lights that are in the scene that we will talk about next to that. So we have 3 different lights. And obviously the whole scene is enveloped in a volume to get the painterly look going. And after some compositing, that's the final result. And it's stuttering a little bit, but you can see the detail that you did see before. Right, okay, now we have to get out of the presentation and go do that. So basically the light sources I used was once the candlelight, then we have an environment, an HDRI. So I used, I used a modern interior for the HDRI. It's again one of Maxim Ross's HDRIs because I really like them. And since you don't see a very distinct reflection on any of those objects, I could get away with using just a modern interior. I just like the lighting situation of that HDRI, giving me a warm light, and it has some accents in there that are looking like candles or something like that. So that was what I was looking for. Then we have a window light. That's an area light that's 100 by 150 centimeters. And with it's slightly focused, I use an EES light to focus the an EES image to focus the lights. And you can actually dial in some different gamma values to get it more focused or less focused. So that's my workaround for not having spotlights in Octane. Then we have a simulated sunlight. It's an even more focused, smaller spotlight with an IES light in there. And when I did the presentation, I looked at that and thought, that already looks nice. I don't even need the other light sources. I don't know why I did them. But anyway, I did them, so I show that. And that's all light sources combined. So that's the clay rendering for the final lighting. And you might have noticed that there are some strange shadows in there. And when I was going over, looking at still lifes, I was seeing that a huge amount of them had like some diagonal shadows in there. So I was wondering why it was. And when I started lighting, I noticed that it was looking much better if you have that. So the old painters just did that right and tried around and looked up different lighting situations, I guess, and they came up with that. I'm not sure what they did back then, but I just modeled some frame to be blocking the light. Now you might ask, why is the frame having like this inside part? Actually, when I did the lighting, it blocked all of the light, so the milk can was black from one side completely, and I wanted to give a little bit more reflection to that part, so I made this translucent, that inner part, to get in the scene a little bit more light and not completely block it. So especially with that light, you can see the shadows forming there, and with the spotlight, you don't even see that because it doesn't hit the obstacle back there. So that's the final light situation with the further away camera. And this is how it looks like in the scene. So obviously I only build what you see in the frame, because otherwise it would be wasted time. It took long enough for that small portion here, so why waste even more time? And you can see that I put the sunlight spotlight in front of the window spotlight. There's a trick: if you set the transparency for the Octane light to 0, it won't cast any shadows on the other light. Otherwise you have shadows from the light in the back, and that obviously you don't want that. So we are back at the learning corner here, and this time it's about colors and saturation. So if you have materials that are completely white, you shouldn't do that. You should always go to 80% on your materials. If you want to have bright materials, if you want your scene to look white, you rather crank up the exposure of the camera or crank up your lighting, but not crank up your materials, because it's a rule universally, materials don't have the possibility to get a 100% light output from the input. Normally you have, even with white materials, an 80% output. Same goes for black materials, so there's no real black materials. I always say that this is, you don't have black holes normally. You would do shading on, so that would be more or less the only reason why you would do something completely black. Obviously, if you know what you're doing and if you want to have an absorber in your scene, you can make it black. Usually, those are gamma free. Those are linear values. Those are no gamma values. So it equals to 15% in the Cinema 4D slider. So if you go to the color picker, it would be 15%. The same goes for every channel, actually. So if you have a very saturated material, that one slider, the R slider is 0 and the B slider is 1, you have to set your sliders accordingly. So the blue slider goes to 80% and the red slider goes to a little bit higher than black, because that's just one wavelength inside of the light, and it goes for all of the light information, not just white light. So what is he talking about? Why is that even necessary? So if you have a lot of GI in your scene, the light will not lose energy while it bounces. And what happens is that you get a room that looks maybe quite nice, but you don't see any shadows. So there's on top, there's a light slightly extruded from the ceiling, and you don't get any contact shadows there because there's no absorption of the light information. So if you also look at the render time, it's 4 minutes 12 seconds. And if you do the same thing with an 80% material, you get the right contact shadows there, and also your render time goes down. Now you might think, okay, we can do that first render and then just get the levels down in Photoshop. Well, sounds good, doesn't work. Because if you do, it looks still washed out. Sorry, might be that one, yeah. And sorry, I must have missed a slide. After that, there should be a slide where it's turned down in Photoshop, but that's the right slide here, so that's how it should look. The same for black materials. If you expose a black material for a longer time, you can see still information in there, and that tells you that there are still photons coming back from that material, since you shouldn't use black materials. Right. So this is coming to close to the end, just 2 more points. So the point here is doing volumetrics. Again, our 3 light sources here. We have our HDRI with volumetrics. Obviously, I rendered them inside of the scene. That's just for visualizing them right now, just a black scene with the volumetrics inside. Here is the window light again, and then we have the spotlight. And I find it quite sad that this shadow of the goblet is almost not visible in the final render, because I was really hoping for it to show up. And those are all the 3 light sources together. So almost last, after that, I think it's compositing. So those are the grains of dust I put on the scene to make it more old and aged. Rusty used Octane Scatter for that. On some of the objects are hair scattered also, like on the cloth and the robe, as we've seen before. Yeah, and then if you want to know about the spiderwebs workflow, I encourage you to look up the ABC, what's it called? Not ABC, IBC, yeah. IBC presentation from Maxon I did on exactly that topic, where I show the whole workflow with the spiderwebs. And basically it's just getting the spline there, then using dynamics to get the weight down so they hang, and then just merge them together so it looks like they're merged at some point. Right, so yeah, we are almost done here. So that, yeah. Sure. In general, the dust on the object, there's with Octane, there's a tool coming that's called Octane Scatter. And Octane Scatter is giving out clones for an object to use. So you can do small dust particles inside of the scatter tool and then scatter it on any objects. What I did here too was getting vertex maps on objects to constrain the dust to different parts of the object. So sometimes, like all of the time, the dust settles down from the top. So I don't want to get dust from the downside, from underneath. So I did that, and it's rather easy to handle. And the good thing about that is that it also supports Maxon. What's it called? Effectors. Thank you. Yeah. So you can afterwards you've scattered them, use effectors to rotate them around, and that makes the end really realistic. Hope that answers your question. So again, we have the candle, the surrounding, and that's already with the volume inside here, the HDRI, the window, and the sun on its own. You can see that the shadow that showed up really nicely before is not visible anymore. And those are all the passes together. Now I also rendered out a glow and glint, so post effects in Octane. This was way too strong, so I dialed it down in compositing, so it's nice to have an extra layer for that to be more flexible. Then I reduced the lightness and saturation of the tomatoes there, because after all my corrections, they were quite blown out. I increased the lightness of the candle, and I did that by using object passes to get the information for the different objects into After Effects. So we have a glow and glint on there, and this is an After Effects glow object that increases the highlights of the objects, if you can see that. And then always compositor's best friend is the vignetting of stuff, so you get a more focused look towards the middle. And since the look, you should be looking at the goblet in the middle, it's quite nice to use that technique. Just a color correction to make it more warm, because it was a little bit too cold for me. And then finally some contrast correction to get the image to pop. And this was also the step the tomatoes were blown out, so I had to dial back the saturation there before. So this one is with chromatic aberration, but I think the projector already has so much chromatic aberration that you don't see it. It's very subtle, but you can see like the detail I did to the glass with the fingerprints, the dust on it. Also, never make glass surfaces perfect. They also have a slight wobble in them, so I tried to do that. You can see it in both of the glass objects here. And what else? Well, it was a tad too dark, so I lit up the midtones. And that's it. That's the final image. Okay, so let's see where we're at. I think we should get maybe 5 minutes break or something, or you can go and never come back if that's was all you wanted to see. And I'm offering to do a live demo after that, so after 5 minutes, those who want can come back and see me unwrapping stuff and doing substance. Thank you. Ja. Okay. Warte mal. Generell hatte ich eigentlich damit nicht so wirklich große Probleme. Was du machen kannst, ist natürlich die Sample-Threshold höher stellen. Ich sehe schon bei was 8 Stunden Renderzeit. Das ist natürlich für ein Volume. Also wenn das ohne Volume gerendert hätte, wäre das wahrscheinlich in einer Stunde oder so durch gewesen. Ja. Ja, es kommt natürlich auch auf das File selber drauf an. Wenn das sehr fokussiert ist, dann produziert das mehr Noise. Aber man kann halt die Samples für das Licht dann einfach höher stellen als für die anderen Lichter. Das ist ja so ein Multiplikator, also das ist nicht wie ein V-Ray wirkliche Samples, sondern das ist halt ja, das ist quasi die Wahrscheinlichkeit, genau, Richtung, ja, das ist das Beste. Ja. Wenn du Linear Color Space in After Effects anhackst, dann drauf addierst, dann sollte das genauso aussehen wie im Rendering. Ja. Sonst wird das viel zu hell. Ja. Kannst du halt ausprobieren und dann halt einmal quasi in Octane rausrendern mit Post-Effekten drauf und dann in After Effects schauen, ob das halt gleich aussieht. Ja. Kruste. Ey. Nee, ist nur bei Octane. Cinema 4D hat ein Gamma auf den Zahlen. Also wenn du 80% in Cinema 4D einstellst, dann ist das irgendwie 65% linear oder sowas. Ja. Ja, genau das. Also wenn ich hier, warte mal, ich kann das gerade mal aufmachen. Das ist schon irgendwo offen. Ja. Wenn ich jetzt hier 0,8 drin habe zum Beispiel und dann hier auf den Color Picker gehe, dann habe ich hier 90%.
Okay.
Und das ist halt der Wert, der lineare 0,8 Wert mit einem Gamma von 2,2 ist dann halt, oder beziehungsweise das ist eine sRGB-Umwandlung, die da passiert, aber das ist ungefähr das gleiche mit einem Gamma 2,2.
Das haben wir nicht Chat gehabt.
Ja, und wenn ich natürlich hier jetzt 80% einstelle, dann kriege ich halt hier den 60%, das, was ich gerade meinte. Okay. Ja, muss man halt wissen, was man da einstellt. Ja, die sind Octane. Still a couple minutes to go, so let's give them a chance to come back. The thing is that I expected to be doing a normal presentation, and then they told me to do a workshop, and I thought, okay, it's like a lot longer, so I needed to gather some more material. Funny thing enough is that I'm likely to be more entertaining if the presentation is shorter. It's like a long stretched thing. Hopefully you're not too tired. Right. Thank you. The question was why choose Octane over other renderer like V-Ray. For me, it's the path tracing for Octane. So with Octane, you get a very high level of accuracy when it comes to light interactions in objects. So you don't have to deal with GI or something. It's like handled by the engine. If you just set it to path tracing, it's all more or less clicks into place, and therefore if you have a white wall, the chances are the white wall in your render looks very similar to what you would have in reality. Also, if you have glass, there are very few renderers that do glass quite nicely. Octane is one of them. The other one is Indigo. I've heard that yesterday there was a presentation about the guy who did camera lenses, and he also used Indigo because of that. So yeah, looking forward to seeing that presentation somewhere. So when it comes to realistic behavior overall, I'm always a bit biased towards Octane because it's unbiased, yeah. Well, there's no real unbiased render, but it's like more unbiased than other renderers, yeah. So I guess we go on with the demo part. So first of all, let's talk a little bit of modeling. It's not really hard to do since they implemented the bevel tool here. So what I would do is going ahead and select some edges and then use the bevel tool in the solid mode to get the supporting edges going. Obviously, that's way too small. Now that's something because I clicked it twice. So have to confess I don't really can model, so sorry about that. All right, now it's working. So if you have problems at edges here, normally if you do that the first time, it looks like this. And if you put that into a subdivision surface object, you get this bend here that you don't really want. So now I have to redo it, of course. But if you do that and want to push that connection to the back, you can just use the other mode here, and then it will do this for you. Obviously, I have a problem here right now, but it doesn't matter for now. So the other thing you should really be paying attention to, I have presets here already in place. What I really want to do always is do the render and the editor subdivision at the same rate, because I've run into problems with Octane of obviously rendering in the viewport, but then when I do the final rendering, it wouldn't render anymore because there was too much geometry on the card. So I always keep that at the same number, so I'm sure that what I see in the viewport or in the live rendering is the same as what I would see later on. The other thing is setting this to edge, otherwise you get problems with the UVs later on. I'll go over that when we do the UVs, which is next. So let's go to our UV scene. Here we go. So let's see. Normally there should be a plug-in pop-up here, but it isn't. So let's see if we can. Oh, there it is. So this is the Rizom UV bridge. And the cool thing is that you just have to select whatever object you want and then just click on that. And if you have Rizom installed, it opens up the object within. Now, I recommend deleting the UV tag on there beforehand, otherwise you will get the UV that you already had, which is mostly very messed up in Unfold, and you want to start with a clean slate here. Cool thing here is, and I don't know if Maxon likes that I'm talking about different software here, but it's, sorry, wrong setting here. If you can customize that for Cinema 4D and get the same shortcuts than in Cinema 4D here. So you can navigate and select and stuff like that the same way as in Cinema 4D. So what I want to do is just a quick unwrap. So I double click on some edges to get a loop cut, or a loop selection rather. So let's just select whatever makes sense. And then I can press C to cut it, or I can just go to the cutter tool up here. Now we need to do even more cuts, for example here. This is one of the easier objects. So the most difficult part with UVing is if you do UVing to unfold the objects before you actually unfold it in you have to have the capacity in your head to do that. So because it's quite tricky if you don't know where to place cuts. And I place cuts here because I rehearsed it before, obviously. Right, let's make them cuts, and I don't want that one, so I stitch it together, back together again. Make this little mistake here, but that looks right now. Okay. So once you've done all your cuts, you can go to the unfold button, and that will unfold and do the first iteration of your placing the islands inside of your UV space. They're quite interesting. Like, those are probably quite good in the relaxation here, but I want to have them straight. And the cool thing is that there are tools for that. So I can go to UV island mode. Let's also take that one, and then just straighten them out. And it's really fast, and you can have really fast feedback. Now, while straightening out, the proportion changed. So to get my old proportion back, I just hit that button, and it will compare all polygons with each other and get the right proportion. So you have the same texel density on every island, if that makes sense. So after that, I'm just doing a quick packing here, and then I'm done. I can hit save, and that will get me back to Cinema 4D with the UVs that we just did. And obviously, that's a slight disadvantage. The object comes back, and you have to replace your old object. But it's better that way. So if something gets messed up along the way, you still have your old objects. You have to set that in the settings here. But yeah. So if we put your UV on here, you can see you have nice UVs. So now it's the thing where I can show the edge thing. If you don't put that to edge and leave it on standard like it is if you load Cinema 4D on default, you can see that UVs are rather distorted everywhere, so not really looking good. So I don't know why Cinema 4D hasn't done that. It's like bothering me for ages to just put it on edge, because then it looks fine. All right, so that's that. Close that. Close that. Open the next one, which is, I guess, texturing. Well, maybe to substance. Did I miss something? I don't know. Well, we also did the inner part right now, so that's when you want to get objects to substance, you can do a low-res and a high-res model. Since I used hero objects that are subdivision objects, and I'm not using a game engine to render, I'm just using high-res objects to put my materials on. What's important is that if you have different objects with the UV space going from 0 to 1 on each of them, so I have that one, and then I have that one. This will cause overlapping in substance, so it gets distracted. So what you need to do if you have that, you can also pack your both objects so they don't occupy the same space. That's another method. But right now what I've chosen is put on 2 different materials on them. So substance will then notice that there are 2 different materials on them, and then just give me 2 materials inside of Substance Painter to work with. What I do here is to export them as FBX. That's sort of established workflow. You can also use OBJ, but FBX supports more information than OBJ. So I'm used to doing that. The only thing, if you want to export high-res objects, is to be sure to use bake subdivision surface. Otherwise, the subdivision surface will not be applied to the object on export, and you get the low-res mesh in Substance. All right. We don't need any cameras, blinds, instances, lights, tracks. Normals we do. Well, I guess that's good. So here we go. So we can open Substance Painter and import our object. It's funny how this is a Maxon workshop and I'm using all the different tools, but eventually coming back to Cinema 4D and rendering there. Hopefully that works. Right. Okay, sound's still working. So just you do a new project. whatever you set here can be reset later, so let's keep it rather small texture for not keeping you waiting with preparation times. Normally, if you do 3D scenes within any render engine, you should go with OpenGL maps for the normal map. We come to that later. And for the workflow, we use PBR workflow. There's more diverse workflows where you can also have like a scattering map and stuff like that. But for rusted cogwheels, it's enough to have like this PBR metallic roughness workflow. Obviously, I have to load my FBX here and then click OK. And if everything goes good, then we have our cogwheel in there. Now you can see that those both materials were imported correctly. So we have an inner and outer material, and we have layers for the material. Now before we start layering, we need to tell Substance what to do with the object. Now, despite Octane, where we have the dirt node that's really ray traced, Substance uses maps, like normal maps and stuff like that, to determine whether the edges is concave or convex and stuff like that. So we need to bake maps before that. So I'm just baking the maps for the author. Cogwheel here. Let's see where I can pull that down. All right. So I'll leave it at standard. You can always rebake that if that's not high enough resolution. The only thing I want to change is with curvature enable seams, because that with every seam of your UV island tries to put an edge there, and that's not what we want. That's for if you're doing game assets and stuff like that. There's other stuff you can care about, like the rays of the ambient occlusion, but it's good for now, because also we are running out of time. So you can also bake for all objects. That would mean that the inner and outer object would be baked at the same time. I guess I want to do that. Just have to apply to all, so all materials are applied with the non-seam version here. And then we have to wait, like what every 3D artist is doing from time to time. Just a good time so you get coffee. And that basically generates normal maps, world position maps, and so on. Well, maybe I should get the sound down. Right. So if I go to that, you can see that it created kind of a couple of maps, like those are the baked maps, like ambient occlusion and a curvature map and a position map and so on. And this is where you shaders are basing the information towards. So if we were very lazy, what we are today, or I am, is we can use a smart material on top of the cogwheel to just show the workflow. So smart materials take exactly that information that we just baked and apply it to the object. So we can use that, for example, and get something like a dirty grain or something like that. Wouldn't fit in the still life, obviously, but you get the idea. So it's as easy as that to get a nice looking, oh, come on, nice looking object. Obviously, there's a ton of other materials in there, so maybe let's do one more try. And basically, those are preset materials, so they have their own layers where you can change things. Let's keep the inner part, that material, because we can. I'm just exporting the outer part of the material later, so what we can do is go back to materials and go use a cobalt pour to get the base, and then go back to the smart materials and do a, for example, a dust layer to get some fine specks here, and then finish that off with, is there a rust? Does anyone use that? Well, what we could do is go here and search for rust and use that one, I guess. and then use a not a smart material, but a procedural smart mask to get your dust do what you want. So maybe use that. Nah. I'm trying to find something that really works. Well, let's stick with that. It's the other way around. Normally you would use that for showing up the edges. You can even invert that, but I'm not going to bother now. So when you're done with your material, when you spend some time with it, not like me doing it in 5 minutes and looking quite unprofessional right now, and you can export the materials, the textures. Now, a small hint here is you have to set up that as a right combination of materials that you can use in your render. And there is the PBR metal rough that we already established. Let's see where that is here. And that material has somewhere a normal, and the normal with the color corresponds to a DirectX normal, but we need an OpenGL normal. So what you do is drag the OpenGL normal there, and then just apply it to the RGB channels. And if you're smart, you can just duplicate that and so call it my own preset or something. And then you can find it here, my own preset, and then just tick off the inner because we don't want to export the inner material right now. Set a path where you want to export to, and basically that's somewhere in the presentation, text output. Okay, and then just export. And this gives you the 4 textures or even more textures depending on what you did with the material that you can then bring inside of Octane. So let's do that. Opening the last scene here, which is the texturing. So, right, let's see if it's already attached. Yes. So we go and open Octane, and hopefully everything's working. So let's try that. Yeah, it is. It looks strange, but it is. I guess I've missed to get the HDRI. Oh, it's just a color. Okay, that's, yeah, it's not loaded the HDRI because it's on my hard drive in my backpack. Right, so let's improvise a bit and use just light. Put it a bit back here so we at least get some directionality of the lighting. Make it a little bit weaker. So here we go. Maybe it was too weak. So, right. So I also prepared a little bit here. So what you need when you bring in PBR textures is actually 2 materials. One material is responsible for the diffuse, and one material is responsible for the metal. So you can see I have color, roughness, normal, and metalness. And that's the 4 maps that you usually need with the PBR workflow. And the only thing I need right now is to go through my object and then just assign the right textures to that. So color, roughness, is that or that? Roughness, normal. Here we go. And then last but not least, the metalness, which is then switching between metal and dielectric surfaces. The rust is dielectric, the rest is metal. Okay, and that should give us a look that is, well, would be 10,000 times better if the HDRI was working. Let's see if we get a better look for that. Just go to environment, set it to black. That already looks better. So you can see that somehow looks the same as here. Obviously, it would be looking better if I had the HDRI, but you can see that. small note here is you have to really be careful about using the right gamma on those. So the color comes in with a gamma of 2.2, and basically all the other textures come in with a gamma of 1. Octane does sort of a normalization of the gamma of the normal map anyway, so I didn't bother to put it to 1.1 because it doesn't change anything. And you have to invert the metalness map. But that's basically it. And right, so if you follow that all, you might say, okay, there's something missing, and obviously I'm not going over volume today. And but last but not least, I'm doing a little bit of dust on the object. So it already looks shit, so let's make it look even more shit. You can imagine how it could look. Right, so there's this object, that's the Octane scatter. And basically, with the Octane scatter, it needs a surface. So we drag in the cogwheel object, and it generates like spheres on that, on every vertice. We don't want that. We want the random distribution, so we get it to surface. Now, it's still a bit dependent on the polygon size, which is annoying sometimes, but you sort of can live with it most of the time. Right, so the other thing is that you can stick whatever object you need to be replaced with the spheres inside of the scatter. So you can just go and find, I don't know, what do we find? We could use figures, but I'm not too experimental today. Maybe use donuts, big donuts. That's way too big, obviously. So let's make them way smaller. And you also notice that the size of the hairy things is adjusting to the size of the object. So let's make them 0.2 here. Oh, that's the value I wanted. So we have little donuts on our cogwheel. The cool thing is that Cinema 4D doesn't handle the geometry, so it stays pretty fast. And therefore, we can go up to, I don't know, a lot of them. It takes Octane a while to prepare, and then you have like very many donuts on your cogwheel. And then you can go to the effector tab here and bring in a MoGraph, for example, random effector, and place it in there. And then it does exactly what the random effector will tell it to do, which is right now change the position. But we can also change the scale and the rotation, which I did with my dust kernels. So let's do that real quick. Maybe 0.8 or something. And then just... So you have like, I don't know, it doesn't even look like donuts anymore. Let's get the distribution number a little bit lower. So last but not least, I want to show you how I did the vertex maps on there, on lots of the objects. Back then, R20 wasn't out yet, but I'm in the beta, so I had access to it. And it has this new fields tool. So what you can do is go to a object. I'm just creating a vertex map by going here. There might be easier ways, but I'm just sometimes very biased with my workflow. Right, so you can have a vertex tag, and there's a fields option back there. So you can tick it, and then you can choose any sort of fields to generate a vertex. And I'm going to select the shader field, and there's actually a shader to have like a world direction for objects, so they align with the colors to the world direction, and that's the normal. Where is it? Does someone see it here? No, fall off. Yeah, sorry, not the normal, the fall off. You should should do the presentation next time. So we can just get a black and white gradient here. And you can see there's something happening with the, or there's rather nothing happening right now. And this is because there's still this freeze in there. Let's get a little bit more space. So if I untick that, now it should be happening something. And probably it's like because the gradient is too lax, it doesn't have enough contrast. So you can just use that to get enough contrast in. So now we have the things that are on top, getting the vertex weight. The cool thing is if you turn that object around and set the shader to be global, it will correspond accordingly. So let's go here and look for the world space, and obviously that changed something. I can just adjust it to, so it will update when you move your object around. Maybe there's a update bug happening here, but you can see it's changing. So let's go back here. And when we have something like that and you want to freeze it, you can just untick the field option here, and it will stay in the vertex map. And I just at that point saved the object and brought it back to R19, and there did my workflow. So the workflow looks like that. It's very simple. Just use the vertex map of the object, drag it into the vertex map slot here, and then use it as a target. Now, for some reason it doesn't work right now, so maybe have to yeah, now you can see that in there's like where the areas gets really steep, you don't get any donuts anymore. So that's basically how I put the dust on everything. Okay, and I think that closes up my presentation. Thank you for all staying so long with me.